The business class lounge at the airport was the kind of place where nothing was supposed to go wrong. Soft lighting, chilled air, every surface polished to a quiet perfection. Sophia Whitmore sat near the window, her spine straight, her fingers scrolling through contract terms on her tablet, completely in control the way she always was. Then the glass fell, then she followed it in front of dozens of frozen, staring faces. A powerful young CEO crumpled to the floor. And no one moved. No one knew what to do. No one except a plainly dressed man with a small boy at his side who stepped forward without a word. Stay until the end because the truth about who that man really was will change the way you see everything. Sophia Whitmore had turned 26 the previous spring, and by every visible measure, her life was exactly where she had engineered it to be. She was the youngest chief executive in the history of MedAccess Technologies, a company her mother's capital had seeded, but that Sophia's own obsessive discipline had built into something formidable. The company specialized in adaptive health monitoring systems, platforms that hospitals, insurance carriers, and emergency response networks used to track patient data in real time. It was serious work in a serious industry, and Sophia treated it with the gravity of a general preparing for a campaign that never ended. She had a way of moving through rooms that people noticed without being able to explain. Not because she was loud, she was almost never loud, but because her attention was total. When she read a document, she read it with the focus of someone who knew exactly which sentence could undo her. When she shook someone's hand, she held eye contact a beat longer than comfort required. She had been called cold by people who did not understand her, and relentless by people who did. Both were accurate. Neither told the full story. That morning she was traveling alone to close the most important contract in Metaxas's short history. A partnership with a regional hospital network that would double the company's client base overnight. Her mother, Margaret Whitmore, the chairman of the holding group that owned MedAccess, had called twice before 7 o'clock in the morning to remind Sophia of the stakes. Sophia had let both calls go to voicemail. She already knew the stakes. She had always known the stakes. Dominic Hale was 31 rows back in the main terminal. Sitting on a hard plastic seat with his 6-year-old son, Leo, sleeping against his shoulder. He was not the kind of man who made an impression at first glance. His jeans were clean, but worn at the knees. His gray jacket had a small repair at the left cuff that he had stitched himself one evening while Leo watched cartoons. He was lean and quiet in the way of someone who had long ago stopped spending energy on things that did not matter. He worked as a freelance technical contractor, diagnostics and maintenance for small medical equipment suppliers, the unglamorous back end of an industry that kept people alive. He charged fair rates, showed up when he said he would, and answered emails the same day. His clients liked him without knowing much about him, which was more or less how he preferred it. He was flying home to see his grandmother in Ohio, the woman who had helped him raise Leo during the first terrible year of doing it alone. Leo had asked to bring her a drawing of a horse, which was currently rolled up and protected inside a cardboard tube in Dominic's backpack. Leo Hale was the kind of child who could sit still longer than most adults. He had his father's eyes, dark, observant, slow to reveal what they were thinking. He had been watching the business class lounge entrance for the past 10 minutes, not because anything had happened there, but simply because his father had glanced in that direction twice, and Leo had learned that when his father looked at something twice, it was worth paying attention to. The two of them occupied different atmospheres, Sophia and Dominic. She was on the upper level of the terminal's new wing, surrounded by leather seating and complimentary sparkling water. He was on the main floor, sharing a row of fixed seats with a family whose children were redistributing crackers across the surrounding 20 square feet. The distance between those two spaces was less than 100 feet. The distance between their worlds, measured by everything the world uses to measure such things, was considerably larger. Sophia had been awake since 4:30 that morning. She had reviewed the contract addendum 3 times, prepared for each of the 6 objections she anticipated from the hospital network's legal team, and eaten a breakfast she did not remember. By the time she settled into the lounge chair closest to the window, Her body was running on a combination of professional momentum and the particular adrenaline that comes from never having learned to properly rest. She noticed her hands first. A slight tremor she could not immediately account for, there in the tips of her fingers as she scrolled through her tablet. She had experienced this before once during a 22-hour negotiation stretch, once the morning after her father's funeral 2 years ago. She catalogued it calmly and reached for her water glass. Hydration. That was almost certainly what this was. The water did not help. The room did an almost imperceptible tilt, and Sophia set the glass down with great precision, the way a person does when they are concentrating very hard on appearing normal. The lounge attendant across the room was refilling a coffee station. 2 men in identical navy suits were discussing something at the high table by the far wall. No one was looking at her. She was grateful for that. She pressed her heels firmly into the floor and willed the tilting to stop. It did not stop. Instead, it deepened. And with it came a warmth behind her eyes that she had never felt before, and a sudden, profound conviction that something was wrong with her in a way that was not dehydration and not fatigue. She reached for the edge of the table. The glass went first, knocked sideways by the involuntary jerk of her arm as her grip failed. It caught the edge of a small decorative plate, and the sound was clean and sharp in the quiet of the lounge, a single crack of crystal against porcelain that turned every head in the room. Then Sophia went down. She did not crumple slowly. She went sideways out of the chair with a weight and finality that made the 3 people closest to her take a step back instead of forward. Her tablet clattered to the floor beside her. One of her earrings scattered under the low table. The lounge went completely silent for one long second, and then it filled with sound, voices, movement, the scraping of chairs, but none of the movement was coordinated, and none of the voices contained instruction. A lounge attendant crossed the room at a near run, then stopped 3 feet away, her hands pressed together in front of her chest. A security guard appeared in the doorway from the corridor, looked at Sophia on the floor, and reached for his radio. One of the navy-suited men had his phone out and was staring at it as though waiting for it to tell him what to do. A woman near the window made a sound that was not quite a word. Down on the main floor, through the glass partition that separated the lounge from the terminal corridor, Dominic Hale had not heard the sound, but Leo had turned his head, and Leo said quietly, the way he said most things, "Dad, someone fell in there." Dominic looked up from the equipment manual he had been paging through on his phone. He followed Leo's line of sight. He saw Sophia on the floor. He saw the attendant frozen 3 feet away. He saw the guard with the radio. And in the time it took a typical person to register what they were seeing and begin to assess their involvement, Dominic was already moving. He did not run, exactly, but he moved with a speed that was precise rather than panicked. He paused at the entrance, where a small sign indicated the lounge was reserved for business-class ticket holders. He looked at the sign. He looked at Sophia on the floor. He walked past the sign. "Everybody take 2 steps back," he said. His voice was not raised, but it carried the quality of a voice that expects to be heard. People stepped back. The attendant looked at him with an expression caught between relief and uncertainty. The security guard lowered his radio slightly. Dominic went to one knee beside Sophia. He did not touch her yet. He tilted his head and watched her for 3 seconds, her color, the movement of her chest, the position of her jaw. Then he placed 2 fingers at the side of her neck, not fumbling for the pulse, but finding it immediately, the way a person finds a light switch in their own home after years of reaching for it in the dark. "She's breathing," he said, to no one and everyone. "Her airway is clear. Don't move her." He looked up at the attendant. "Has she been here long? Have you seen her before today?" The attendant managed to say she had arrived about 40 minutes ago. Alone. Had seemed fine. Did she eat or drink anything here? Was she distressed when she came in? The attendant said she had ordered sparkling water. Had seemed focused. Had been on her tablet. Dominic nodded. He gently repositioned Sophia's head, tilting her chin with the angle and pressure of someone who understood exactly what that angle was for. He turned to the security guard. "I need you to call medical services, not the general airport line, the emergency medical team that works this terminal. They're stationed near gate 42. Tell them suspected vasovagal syncope with possible cardiac involvement. Tell them she was unresponsive on arrival and that her pulse is present, but shallow. Give them those words exactly." The guard stared at him. "Those words exactly," Dominic repeated evenly. "It will save them time when they get here." The guard got on his radio. Dominic slid his jacket off in one motion and folded it under Sophia's head with a careful, practiced placement. He checked her wrists, pressing lightly at the pulse points there as well, cross-referencing what his fingers found against what his eyes were reading: the slight grayish cast at the edges of her lips, the involuntary flutter of her left hand, the position of her shoulder blades against the floor. He was not guessing. He was reading. "Does anyone know her?" he asked the room. Silence. Then one of the navy-suited men said she was the CEO of some health company, he thought. He had recognized her from a conference. Dominic asked if she had any known allergies or conditions. No one knew. He continued his assessment without visible frustration at that fact. He spoke to Sophia directly, quietly, in a steady tone, not the performative reassurance of someone trying to appear calm, but the measured communication of someone maintaining a patient's orientation and trust. "You're on the floor of the airport lounge. You passed out. Medical help is on the way. You don't need to move. Just breathe." There was no visible response from her. But something in the room changed anyway. The chaos, which had been structural, everyone present but no one connected, began to organize itself around Dominic's calm. People moved to give space without being asked a second time. The attendant went and retrieved a small first aid case from behind the counter. One of the men held back the small crowd that had begun to gather at the lounge entrance from the corridor. Leo stood just inside the doorway where Dominic had entered. He did not look frightened. He did not look away. He watched his father with an expression of quiet concentration. His hands in his jacket pockets, the cardboard tube with the drawing of the horse held under one arm. He had seen his father do this before, not this exactly, but this kind of focus, this stillness in the middle of something urgent. He understood in the way that children understand things that have always been true for as long as they can remember, that this was simply what his father did. The first response team arrived in under 4 minutes. 2 paramedics with a portable kit, moving fast through the cleared corridor that the security guard had established. They came through the lounge entrance and went directly to Sophia. And then the lead paramedic stopped for a half second when he saw how she was positioned. He looked at Dominic. "You do this?" "Recovery position. Airway clear," Dominic said. Pulse came back stronger about 90 seconds ago. She had a brief motor response in her left hand 2 minutes back. "I don't have her history." The paramedic knelt and began his own assessment, working quickly and precisely. And what he found confirmed what Dominic had told him. He glanced up once more. "You a doctor?" Dominic shook his head. The paramedic looked at him for a moment with an expression that said he did not entirely believe that, and then turned back to his work. Sophia's eyes opened, not abruptly, not with the dramatic gasp of someone returning from somewhere far away, but gradually, the way someone wakes from a deep sleep in an unfamiliar room, taking in the ceiling and trying to assemble the context. The light in the lounge was soft and yellow. She could hear voices. She could feel the floor under her and the softness under her head. And she registered with some distant, still functioning part of her mind that the thing under her head was folded fabric, a jacket, she would realize later, that did not belong to her. She tried to speak. The paramedic told her to stay still. The room, which had been a sustained hum of low voices and half-controlled alarm for the past several minutes, went quieter now. Not silent, the paramedics were communicating. The security guard was relaying information. Someone in the corridor was still managing the gathering crowd. but something had released. The worst possibility, the one that had been hovering over the room since Sophia hit the floor, had receded enough that people could breathe again. The attendant, who had pressed herself against the counter when the paramedics arrived, looked across the room to where Dominic was standing. He had stepped back to give the medical team room. He was watching Sophia with the focused attention of someone making sure a task had been completed properly, not the attention of someone waiting to be seen. "Who are you?" the attendant asked him. She said it the way people say things when they realize they should have asked much sooner. Dominic said his name. He said nothing else. One of the navy-suited men had his phone out again, and this time it did not look like he was waiting for it to tell him what to do. It looked like he was photographing Dominic without being obvious about it, which he was not. Because at least 3 other people in the room were doing the same thing. The airport medical team stabilized Sophia and began the process of determining whether she needed hospital transport. It was determined that she did as a precaution, not as an emergency, which was itself a form of good news. While they worked, the lounge settled into the particular aftermath of a shared crisis. Everyone present had become, briefly and involuntarily, part of the same experience, and now they processed it in the way people do by talking. The attendant told a colleague that the man had walked in from the main terminal. Business class lounge, reserved boarding, and he had just walked past the sign. Nobody had stopped him. Nobody had wanted to. One of the men who had been at the high table said he had asked the man point blank if he was a doctor, and the man had said no. But the way he had assessed the woman on the floor, the specific instructions he had given the security guard, the terminology he had used when the paramedics arrived, none of that was amateur. None of that was the result of a basic first aid course. "Dad said always check breathing first," Leo said. He said it to no one in particular, in the matter-of-fact tone of a 6-year-old sharing information he found entirely unremarkable. He was standing near a column at the edge of the lounge, watching the paramedics finish their work, eating a package of crackers that his father had produced from the backpack at some point in the preceding minutes. The attendant looked at him, then at Dominic, who was speaking to the security guard in a low voice near the entrance, then back at Leo. "What else does your dad say?" she asked. Leo considered this with the gravity the question deserved. "He says if someone can talk, they can breathe. And if they can breathe, there's time." The attendant did not have a response to that. She looked back at Dominic. He was pointing at something on the security guard's radio, explaining something about frequencies or channels, and the guard was nodding in the way that people nod when they are being shown how something works by someone who knows it better than they do. A paramedic who had overheard Leo's comment paused on his way back to the equipment case. He looked at Dominic with a kind of professional recognition, the way a craftsman identifies another craftsman by the calluses on their hands. By the time Sophia was transferred to the transport gurney, and the lounge had begun to resume the shape of a normal afternoon, Dominic Hale and his son were gone. He had not made an announcement. He had not sought out the lounge manager, or left a card, or waited for anyone to process what had happened and remember to thank him. He had retrieved his backpack from where he had set it near the entrance. He had taken Leo by the hand, and he had walked back out through the corridor toward the main terminal with the same unhurried, purposeful stride he had walked in with. The lounge attendant realized he had left when she turned to ask if he wanted water. The chair he had briefly occupied was empty. The space where he had knelt on the floor was empty. His jacket, the gray one with the repaired cuff, was gone, too, because he had retrieved it from under Sophia's head once the paramedics had provided a proper support cushion, folding it over his arm without ceremony. When Sophia was settled on the gurney and the immediate work was done, she became coherent enough to ask the question that had been forming through the fog of her recovery since the moment she had first registered the ceiling of the lounge and the voice telling her to breathe. "Where is he?" she asked. Her voice was thin and slightly hoarse, but precise. The paramedic assumed she meant a traveling companion. He told her there was no one with her when they arrived. The security guard, who overheard, stepped in and explained about the man from the main terminal. Sophia turned her head enough to look at the lounge entrance, empty. She asked what his name was. Someone said Dominic. Someone else thought there was a last name, but wasn't certain. No one had a contact number. No one had thought to ask. He just left? She said. He had a flight, the guard said, a little helplessly. He had his kid with him. Sophia said nothing, but her expression, which had been stripped of its habitual composure by the simple fact of having been horizontal on the floor of a public room, held something that was not simply gratitude. It was the expression of someone who had just encountered something they did not have a category for. She did not go to the hospital. That is to say, she went, they insisted on it, and she was still uncertain enough on her feet that she did not argue, but she was discharged the same afternoon with a recommendation for follow-up testing, a printed list of symptoms to watch for, and a diagnosis of vasovagal syncope exacerbated by dehydration, fatigue, and elevated stress. The hospital's cardiologist said her heart was fine. He said it with the slight emphasis of someone who had expected to find otherwise. Her mother arrived at the hospital before Sophia was even transferred out of observation. Margaret Whitmore moved through hospitals the way she moved through boardrooms, as though everyone present were slightly in her way, and she had decided to forgive them for it. She held Sophia's hand for a long time without saying anything, which was more than Sophia had expected, and which told Sophia that she had been more frightened than she was letting on. The contract signing was postponed by 3 days. Sophia rescheduled it from her hospital room using her phone. Margaret watched this happen without comment. 2 days later, feeling recovered and sleeping more than usual and somewhat irritated by both of those conditions, Sophia made a call to the airport operations center and asked, politely, and then slightly less politely, to review the security footage from the business class lounge at the time of the incident. She told herself it was professional habit. She was a person who needed complete information. She did not function well with gaps. That was what she told herself. The airport was cooperative in the careful, hedged way of institutions that have been approached by someone with both a legitimate reason and visible determination. She was provided with footage and told she could not take copies, but could review it on site. She went. She sat in a small room with a security supervisor and watched 40 minutes of footage compressed into 20 minutes of review. She watched herself arrive at the lounge. She watched herself order water and open her tablet. She watched herself begin to fail, and this was difficult in a way she had not anticipated, to watch herself losing control of her body with such clinical visibility, as though her collapse were a slide in a presentation she was giving about someone else. Then she watched Dominic come through the entrance. She watched him come through the entrance, and she watched him move to her with the unhurried directness of someone who already knew where they were going and what they would do when they got there. She watched his hands. She watched Leo stand in the doorway, exactly as still as she remembered him being in the peripheral awareness she had retained through the early part of the event. She watched Dominic lean close and speak to her, and she had no memory of what he had said, but she could see from his posture and his pace that whatever it was had not been distress. She asked the security supervisor to pull the entry log for the lounge during that window. He told her the lounge was reserved boarding only. She asked him who else had badged through at that time. Dominic Hale's name was not on the lounge's boarding class entry list. He had come through on foot from the terminal corridor, past the sign, without badging. His ticket, which the supervisor was able to pull through the terminal's gate access records, when Sophia asked, was a standard economy fare. Seat 34B. Booked 4 weeks earlier. Destination Columbus, Ohio. She wrote the name down. She wrote it carefully, the way she wrote things she intended to use. Finding Dominic Hale was not complicated once she had the name and the destination. Sophia had built a company on the premise that information, properly organized, could save lives. She was not unfamiliar with the process of finding what she needed to know. What she found surprised her, though. Not the finding itself. The details, once assembled, resolved into a picture that made a strange and particular sense, but the distance between what those details described and the man she had briefly, groggily perceived on the floor of the lounge. Dominic Hale had worked for 7 years as a biomedical systems technician and emergency response coordinator for a nonprofit that operated in partnership with several urban trauma centers. He had specialized in the intersection of technical systems and field medical response, training emergency personnel in the use of diagnostic equipment, coordinating with hospitals on protocol updates, sometimes working directly alongside first response teams in the field. His record in that role was impeccable. His supervisor's notes described him, in the dry language of professional evaluation, as one of the most reliable responders on the team with an unusually high degree of procedural retention and situational composure. He had left the position 3 years ago. There was no record of a formal resignation. There was a 6-week gap in his employment history that corresponded, when Sophia cross-referenced what she could find, with a period in which his wife, Claire Hale, had been admitted to a hospital following a sudden cardiac event. Claire Hale had died. She was 28 years old. Leo had been 3. Sophia sat with this information for a long time. She thought about the way Dominic had come through the lounge entrance without hesitating. She thought about his hands on her pulse points, finding what they were looking for without searching. She thought about the specific words he had given the security guard, vasovagal syncope with possible cardiac involvement, words that had stripped minutes off the response time because the paramedics arrived already oriented. She thought about Leo eating crackers and watching with his father's eyes, entirely unafraid. She thought about what it meant to carry a knowledge like that, a knowledge built in the rooms of hospitals, in the back of ambulances, in the systems and protocols of emergency response, and then to walk away from it. Not because the knowledge became useless. Not because you lost the ability to apply it, but because something had happened that was so much larger than any protocol, and the protocol had not been enough, and the gap between what you knew and what you could not prevent had grown too wide to stand inside anymore. And then she thought about the fact that he had walked back into a room that looked exactly like that gap. A person on the floor. A pulse that needed finding. A team that didn't know what to do. He had walked into it without hesitating. Not because he had processed his grief and arrived somewhere clean on the other side of it, but because someone needed what he had, and the part of him that had been trained to respond to that need was still there, intact, regardless of everything that had happened to the man around it. She closed her laptop. She sat quietly in her apartment for a while. Then she called her mother. She did not tell Margaret what she had found, not in detail. She said she had been thinking about the incident and about what it meant that someone had been trained to respond the way Dominic had responded and had not been connected to any system that used that training. Margaret said, in the careful tone she used when she thought Sophia was drawing a professional conclusion from an emotional experience, that this was something they could discuss once Sophia had fully recovered. Sophia said she had fully recovered. Margaret said she knew. She still thought they should wait. They did not wait very long. She found the garage on a Tuesday afternoon. She had the address from a business registration, Dominic Hale, sole proprietor, medical equipment diagnostics and maintenance filed in the county records of the city he had grown up in, an hour outside Columbus. She drove herself. She did not tell her assistant where she was going. It was a converted 2-bay garage at the back of a small property, the kind of space that had been methodically organized into something functional without any particular effort at aesthetics. The bay doors were open. There was a bench along one wall with testing equipment she recognized from Med Access's own supply chain's calibration tools, a portable diagnostic unit, and component drawers labeled in a system she could see the logic of without needing to be told how it worked. On the concrete floor near the entrance, someone had drawn a large circle in chalk, and inside the circle was a horse, and inside the horse was a note in 6-year-old handwriting that said "Good horse." Dominic was at the bench with his back to the door, working on a circuit board under a lamp. He knew someone was there. He had heard the car, but he did not turn immediately, in the way of someone who has learned not to be startled by arrivals. When he turned and saw her, his expression did not change much. He looked at her the way he had looked at everything she had managed to observe him looking at steadily, taking in what was there. He set down the tool in his hand. Sophia said, "I wanted to thank you." She had prepared more than that. She had prepared a great deal more than that, but standing in the doorway of his garage with the chalk horse on the floor between them, she found that what she had prepared felt like too much, and what she had said felt like the right amount. Dominic said, anyone would have done it. No, Sophia said, they wouldn't have. She said it without argument in her voice, simply as a statement of something she had verified. I watched the footage. I looked up what you did before, what you used to do. She paused. I'm sorry about your wife. He was quiet for a moment. Not close. Not the silence of someone shutting a door, but the silence of someone absorbing something carefully. Leo, he called. A moment passed. Then Leo appeared from somewhere deeper in the garage, carrying a small orange he had apparently been peeling in a focused and time-consuming way. He looked at Sophia with the same patient attention he had given her from the lounge doorway 2 weeks earlier. Then he smiled, briefly and without particular agenda, the way children smile at things they have decided are not a threat. Sophia did not think of herself as someone easily undone by the smiles of children, but something shifted in her chest with a slow, unglamorous weight, and she thought about the floor of the lounge and the voice that had told her there was time, and the man who had known there was time because he had once stood somewhere much worse and discovered that knowing what to do was not always the same as having enough time. She did not say any of that. What she said was that she had a proposal she wanted to walk him through when he had a moment. Something she was developing for Med Access. Something that would pay fairly if he was interested in consulting. She said it the way she said professional things directly, without inflation, but something in her voice was different from the voice she used in boardrooms, and she was aware of that without entirely being able to correct it. Dominic looked at her for a moment. Then he gestured at a metal stool near the bench. I have a few minutes, he said. The proposal Sophia brought to Med Access's executive team 6 weeks later was not what her mother had expected. Margaret had anticipated an initiative, a partnership, a product expansion, a new vertical. What Sophia presented was a training program, mandatory first response education for every Med Access employee at every level of the organization. Not the 20-minute online module that satisfied most corporate liability requirements, a real curriculum built in partnership with emergency response specialists and designed to bridge the gap between technical knowledge and field-level competence. She had titled the program simply and without flourish. The board received it with the polite weariness that boards reserve for proposals from young executives who seem to be prioritizing something other than quarterly revenue. Margaret sat at the far end of the table and listened without expression. Sophia walked them through the data. She showed them the response time analysis, the research on bystander effect intervention rates, the case studies from hospitals that had embedded similar training in their administrative staffs, and seen measurable changes in critical event outcomes. She was thorough and specific and not persuadable on the central point. The board approved the program by a margin of 4-2. Margaret voted in favor. After the meeting, Margaret stayed in the boardroom while the others filed out. She waited until the room was empty. Then she said, "You're thinking about the man at the airport." Sophia said, "Yes." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said finally. "You should be." Dominic did not take the consulting position Sophia had offered him that day in the garage. He considered it, and he and Sophia had 2 more conversations about it over the following month. And in the end, he said he thought he was not quite ready to step back into that work in a formal way, and she told him she understood, and she believed she did. He helped shape the curriculum, however. He reviewed the training materials and flagged the gaps not with the language of a consultant covering liability, but with the direct specificity of someone who had stood in the spaces where those gaps became consequential. His name was not on the program's documentation. He did not ask for it to be. Leo's drawing of the horse, Sophia learned later, had been delivered to his great-grandmother in Ohio, who apparently kept it on her refrigerator between a photograph of Dominic at some younger age and a postcard from somewhere on the coast. Small things arranged close together, held in place. The training program launched in the spring. The first cohort was 47 employees from MedAccess's operations, facilities, and administrative teams. They learned how to identify a compromised airway. They learned what vasovagal syncope meant and why it mattered to know the difference between that and a cardiac event. They learned how to speak to someone who had fallen and was trying to understand where they were and what to say to make the gap between not knowing what was happening and help arriving feel like a distance that could be crossed. They learned that there is almost always something a person can do if they know what to do and that the knowing is available to anyone who decides to acquire it. In the airport lounge on the day it happened, before the paramedics arrived and before the room had assembled itself around his calm, Dominic Hale had done what he had been trained to do. He had done it without anyone asking. Without staying to be seen. Without requiring the moment to be anything other than what it was, a person on a floor. A pulse that needed finding and whatever time remained to find it. He had been right that there was enough time. He almost always had been.